husband drove to the hardware store every Saturday morning for 31 years. That was just what he did. 7:30, without an alarm, without coffee first, without telling me what he needed. He'd come back 2, sometimes 3 hours later with a small paper bag, a handful of screws, a can of WD-40, a new paintbrush, and set it on the workbench in the garage like he'd accomplished something important. I never questioned it. Why would I? Gerald was a man who needed his routines the way other men needed fishing or football. The hardware store was his. I had my garden. That was how we worked. 31 years. I want you to hold that number for a second before I tell you the rest. I was 63 years old when my husband died on a Tuesday afternoon in March. I was in the backyard pulling up the last of the winter kale when my son called. He's the steady one, my son, kind of person who chooses his words carefully, even when he's falling apart. When I heard his voice, I knew before he said it. Mom, you need to come inside. Gerald had collapsed in the parking lot of his office. Cardiac arrest. By the time the paramedics reached him, he was already gone. He was 67 years old, 20 pounds overweight, and had refused to see a cardiologist for the better part of a decade. I had nagged him about it exactly 47 times. I counted once as a joke during one of our arguments. He'd laughed and said, 50 and I'll go. We never made it to 50. At the funeral, people told me I was strong. I heard it so many times that word started to sound hollow, like a coin that had been passed through too many hands. What they didn't know, what I couldn't have told them then, was that I wasn't strong. I was numb. And underneath the numbness, something else. Something I couldn't name yet. A week after we buried him, my daughter flew in from Denver. She's always been the one who charges at things head first, the opposite of her brother. She came in with her rolling suitcase and her no-nonsense energy and said, Mom, we need to go through Dad's files. I told her there was no rush. She said, there's always a rush with estates. Trust me. I didn't argue. I made coffee, and we sat down in Gerald's study. A room I'd always treated as his, knocking before entering even when he wasn't home, as if his presence still lived in the shelves of organized binders and labeled folders. That study was Gerald in a room, everything in its place, everything accounted for, or so I believed. We found the first account by accident. My daughter was flipping through a folder labeled MIC Financial and pulled out a statement from a bank I didn't recognize. Not our credit union, not the investment firm Gerald had used for our retirement accounts, a small regional bank in a town 40 minutes from where we lived. Did you know Dad had an account at Lakeview Savings? I set down my coffee cup. No, this statement is from 8 months ago. The balance is... She stopped. Mom, there's $42,000 in here. The room got very quiet. She kept going through the folder. There were more statements. Lakeview Savings, going back 11 years. The balance had been higher once, much higher. Money had been going in and coming out, regular as a heartbeat. The deposits came every month, routed from an account I'd never seen. The withdrawals were harder to track. Cash. Always cash. I sat there and I let myself think the thought I'd been refusing. Gerald had a secret. Not a small one. My son came over that evening. He's an accountant, which is both a blessing and a curse in a situation like this, because he understood exactly what he was looking at. He sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and Gerald's folders spread around him, and I watched his face do the thing it does when something's wrong, a slight tightening around his jaw, the way he blinks a little too slowly. There are 3 separate accounts, he said finally. All at Lakeview Savings, one in Dad's name only, one in the name of a business I've never heard of, GW Consulting, LLC, and one... He paused. He looked at me. One in your name, Mom. Just your name. That's not possible. I've never set foot in that bank. There's a signature card on file. I've never set foot in that bank. There's a signature card on file. Someone signed your name. I heard it, but I couldn't quite land on it. The way you hear bad news sometimes through a thick wall of glass, muffled, distant, the shape of it clear, but the sound still arriving. My daughter said what I couldn't. He forged your signature. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the bed Gerald and I had shared for 34 years, and I stared at the water stain on the ceiling that we'd meant to fix for a decade, and I tried to build a different explanation. Maybe there was an innocent reason. Maybe GW Consulting was something he'd set up for tax purposes and just forgot to mention. Maybe the account in my name was something he'd done to help me in case something happened to him. A kind of backup plan he'd never gotten around to explaining. The hardware store. Every Saturday for 31 years. I thought about all the times I'd ask what he needed from there, and he'd shrug and say whatever I'd find. I thought about the small bags he brought home. A package of hooks. A tube of caulk. A box of nails we never used. I'd always assumed the shopping was secondary to the going, that he just needed the routine, the solitude, an hour to himself. What if the shopping was the cover? My son found a storage unit. He'd been cross-referencing Gerald's bank withdrawals with recurring charges on a credit card statement. A credit card I'd also never seen. Also in Gerald's name only. Also something he'd kept entirely separate from our finances. One line item appeared every month for 9 years. $74 to clear past storage, Unit 14B, on Route 9 just outside of town. 40 minutes from our house. In the same direction as Lakeview Savings. In the same direction as the hardware store. We drove out there on a Thursday morning, my son and I. The storage facility was one of those anonymous orange and white places, rows of metal doors. A keypad at the gate. Gerald had apparently paid for the unit on autopay, had a code, had a key that we found on a ring in his desk drawer labeled simply spare, the kind of label that discourages further questions. The unit was climate controlled. Inside, 3 filing cabinets, 2 plastic storage totes, and a small fireproof safe. My son looked at me. I nodded. We started with the filing cabinets. The first cabinet held the business records for GW Consulting, LLC. Gerald had incorporated it in Delaware 11 years ago. The year our youngest graduated college, the year I'd started part-time work at the local library, the year we'd finally paid off the mortgage, and I'd thought, we made it, we're going to be okay. GW Consulting had a client, one client, for 11 years, a company called Paragon Fabrication out of Ohio. Gerald had been doing contract financial auditing for them, quiet, under the table, off the books of his regular firm. The income was substantial. Over the 11 years, based on what my son could calculate from the statements, Gerald had funneled somewhere between $380,000 and $420,000 through GW Consulting and into the Lakeview accounts. None of it had ever come home. None of it had ever been reported on our joint tax returns. The second cabinet was worse. Inside were documents related to a real estate investment. A small commercial property in a town I'd never heard of, 40 miles north. Gerald had purchased it 7 years ago for $210,000. He'd financed it through a private lender using a personal guarantee signed in my name, a signature I had not written. My son sat down on the concrete floor of that storage unit. He's 40 years old and had his own mortgage and his own children and his own life to worry about. But in that moment, he looked like a boy who'd just been told something that couldn't be untrue. He pressed his fingers against his eyes. "Mom," he said, "the property went into default 3 years ago. There's a judgment against you, against me, and your name for $194,000. The air in that storage unit smelled like cold metal and dust. I stood very still and let that number settle over me the way you let cold water settle when you've just been submerged. Not fighting it, just letting it be real. "What about the safe?" I said. He looked up at me. "Let's open the safe," I said. We had a locksmith out the next morning. Inside the safe, 2 envelopes. One was labeled with my name in Gerald's handwriting. The same handwriting that had written our grocery lists and our Christmas cards and the notes he'd leave me on the counter when he left early. The other envelope was sealed and had no label at all. I opened mine first. "If you found this, then I'm gone, and you found all of it. I know there's nothing I can write here that covers what I've done. I know that. I've been trying to find a way out for 3 years, and every time I think I'm close, something else collapses. The property was supposed to be an investment, something to give us more in retirement. When it went bad, I panicked. I used your name because I thought I could fix it before you ever had to know. I could not fix it. I'm sorry. I love you. That was always true. Please open the second envelope when you're ready. I read it twice. Then I set it down on the workbench next to me, and I breathed. In. Out. In. Out. In. Out. I did not cry. I think I'd already used up the part of me that cried on other things. I opened the second envelope. Inside was a single piece of paper, a handwritten list of account numbers, passwords, the name and phone number of a man named Arthur Simmons, described in Gerald's handwriting as the only person who knows everything. Tell him I said to help you. My daughter did not take it well. She'd been Gerald's favorite, or at least that was the family joke. She had his stubbornness, his laugh, his way of walking into a room like she owned it. When I called her to explain what we'd found, she went very quiet in the way that means she's not processing. She's building a case. There has to be an explanation, she said. Dad was meticulous. He wouldn't just, he did. You haven't talked to a lawyer yet. You don't know the full picture. My daughter, I said, and I kept my voice even. There is a $194,000 judgment against me that I never consented to. I have my husband's letter admitting he forged my signature. That is the full picture. She hung up. Not angrily. She just ran out of things to say and stopped talking, which for her is the same thing. My son called me an hour later. She's upset. I know. Give her time. I know that too, I said. But I'm not going to pretend the truth is something different to make her more comfortable. Arthur Simmons turned out to be a retired CPA from Gerald's former firm who had, apparently, known about GW Consulting for the better part of a decade. He hadn't been Gerald's partner exactly, more like the person Gerald had occasionally confided in, who had tried more than once to tell him to come clean. He'd known things were bad. He hadn't known about the judgment in my name. When I called him, he was quiet for a long time after I explained why I was calling. Then he said, Mrs. Whitmore, I am so sorry. I told him to tell you. I told him a dozen times. I know, I said, even though I didn't. I need you to help me now. He did. He connected me with a forensic accountant and a lawyer who specialized in financial fraud cases. He gave me copies of everything he had. He answered every question my son asked, sitting across from us at a conference table in his small office, looking like a man relieved to finally be allowed to tell the truth. The lawyer's name was Sandra, early 50s, no nonsense, in the way that competent women who fought for every inch tend to be. She listened to the whole story without interrupting. When I finished, she set her pen down and looked at me directly. Your husband committed fraud, she said. Identity theft, tax fraud. The judgment against you is the result of a contract signed with a forged signature, which means it shouldn't be enforceable against you personally. But we're going to have to prove that in court, and I'll be honest, it's going to take time and money. How much time? 8 months to a year, if we're efficient. And the IRS? Because my son had flagged it, 11 years of unreported income from GW Consulting meant back taxes, potential penalties. That's a separate process. We'll file amended returns. We can make the case that you had no knowledge and no access to the income. The IRS has seen this before. She paused. You'll need documentation of everything. Bank records, the storage unit, the letter, every piece of paper. I have it, I said. She looked at me with something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite admiration. Something in between. Most people in your situation would have fallen apart by now. I don't have that luxury, I said. I have a judgment in my name and no retirement savings, and a daughter who thinks I'm wrong about her father. Falling apart is for later. I went back to work. I'd been part-time at the library for years, 2 days a week, mostly because I liked it, not because we needed the money. We'd had a solid retirement plan, or so I'd believed. Our financial advisor had met with Gerald and me twice a year for 15 years, and every time he'd shown us charts and projections that made the future look cushioned and manageable. What I didn't know was that the retirement accounts he was showing us were funded with the income Gerald reported, not the income he didn't. The real picture was thinner than I'd understood. Not destitute, but not what I'd planned for. The library director, A woman named Rosalind, who's been running that building for 22 years, sat me down in her office when I came to ask about going full-time. "You don't have to explain," she said. "I'd like to," I said. And I did, briefly. Not everything, but enough. She listened. Then she said, "I'd been waiting to offer you the collections manager position for 2 years. I just didn't think you'd want the hours." "I want the hours," I said. I started full-time the following Monday. The work was familiar and grounding in the way that only familiar work can be when everything else has become unrecognizable. I knew those shelves. I knew which patrons came every Tuesday morning, and which ones called ahead to hold books, and which ones needed someone to sit with them while they figured out the digital catalog. I knew how to help people find what they were looking for, which felt, in those months, like the only skill I had that still felt solid. My daughter called 7 weeks after she'd hung up on me. I almost didn't recognize her voice at first. Not because it was different, but because it was smaller. She's not a small-voiced person. She's the one who argues with airline agents and sends back food and writes letters to the editor. To hear her quiet like that was its own kind of alarm. "Mom," she said, "I need to tell you something." "Okay." I was going through some old mail at Dad's office, the stuff they boxed up and sent home after he died, and I found something. A pause. He opened a line of credit in my name. 5 years ago. I never knew. The balance is $31,000. I closed my eyes. Gerald. "Your credit." I started. "I know. I pulled my report. It's on there. I have to dispute it." Her voice cracked on the last word just slightly. "Mom, I'm sorry I didn't believe you." "Come home," I said. "We'll figure it out together." She was there by the weekend. The 3 of us, my son, my daughter, and I, sat around the kitchen table with Sandra on speakerphone, and we talked about my daughter's credit line the way we talked about everything else, practically, with documents, with a plan. Sandra added it to the case. The pattern of fraudulent accounts, she said, now extended to 2 family members, which actually strengthened the argument that this was systematic behavior, not isolated error. My daughter sat across from me and said, "He was my dad. He coached my soccer team. He taught me to drive. He came to every single one of my college debates." "I know," I said. "How can someone be both of those things?" "I thought about that a lot," I said. "I think people are rarely just one thing. He loved us. I believe that completely. He also made choices that hurt us badly. Both of those are true at the same time." She didn't say anything for a long time. "Then I'm so angry at him." "So am I." "I don't know what to do with that." "You don't have to do anything with it right now," I said. "You don't have to do anything with it right now," I said. "You just have to get through today." The court date was set for October. By then, we'd been at this for nearly 7 months. Sandra had built what she described as an unusually well-documented case, thanks partly to Arthur Simmons and partly to Gerald's own meticulous record-keeping. All that organization, all those labeled folders, had ultimately made it easier to trace exactly what he'd done. His thoroughness, which had always seemed like a virtue, had become the evidence against him. The hearing was on a Wednesday. Overcast and cool, the kind of Ohio fall day that can't decide if it wants to be summer or winter. My son sat beside me. My daughter was there too. It was the first time all 3 of us had been in the same room since she'd come home in August. The opposing counsel, the lender who held the judgment, was a firm from Columbus. Their argument was that as Gerald's spouse, I had benefited from the marriage and could reasonably have been expected to know about the loan. Sandra presented the forensic accountant's analysis showing that the loan proceeds had moved directly into the GW Consulting account and then into the Lakeview accounts, none of which I had access to or knowledge of. She presented Gerald's letter. She presented Arthur Simmons's testimony. She presented the handwriting expert's report confirming the forged signature. When the judge, a woman in her late 50s, named the Honorable Ruth Landis, delivered her decision, she did it the way someone delivers a conclusion they've already reached. Clear, firm. Based on the evidence, the judgment was not enforceable against me. The forged signature could not bind me to a contract I hadn't agreed to. My son let out a breath he'd been holding for 7 months. I sat very still for a moment, the way you sit when something heavy has been removed, and your body is still remembering what it felt like to carry it. Then I gathered my papers, stood up, and walked out. The IRS process took another 4 months. Sandra and a tax attorney we brought in filed amended returns for the years Gerald had operated GW Consulting. We documented my complete lack of access or knowledge. There were penalties. There are always penalties, but they were assessed against Gerald's estate, not against me personally. By February of the following year, the worst of it was resolved. Not all of it. The property in default was still working through the courts. The estate was complicated, and there were still months of paperwork ahead. But the immovable, terrifying parts were done. I was not going to lose my house. My name was being cleared. My daughter's fraudulent credit line was being disputed and resolved. My retirement was thinner than I'd expected. But it was there. Rosalind offered me something unexpected in March, about a year after Gerald died. The library had partnered with a local community center to offer financial literacy workshops. Basic stuff: budgeting, understanding credit, knowing what's in your own accounts. They needed someone to help facilitate. She thought of me. "You don't have to share your story," she said, "but I think you'd be good at it. You know how to talk to people where they are." I thought about it for 2 days. Then I said yes. The first workshop was a Tuesday evening in April. 12 people showed up, mostly women, a range of ages. I prepared notes, a handout, information about credit reports and how to access them. I got about 10 minutes in before a woman in the back, maybe 50, wearing a gray cardigan, her hands folded in her lap, raised her hand and said, "Can I ask something? My husband handles all our finances. He says I don't need to worry about it. I never even look at our accounts. Is that okay?" I set down my handout. I told her about the hardware store. About 31 years of Saturday mornings. About the small paper bags of screws and caulk and nails we never used. Coming home from somewhere 40 minutes away. I told her about the storage unit and the filing cabinets and the letter in Gerald's careful handwriting. The room was very quiet. "It's not okay," I said finally. "It doesn't mean your husband is doing what mine did. It doesn't mean you can't trust him, but it means that you don't know. And not knowing your own finances isn't love, it's a gap that can become a crisis if something goes wrong." She didn't say anything, but she nodded. After the workshop, she stayed behind while the others filed out. She waited until we were alone. Then she said, "He got very angry the last time I asked to see our bank statements. He said I was accusing him of something. I asked if she had anyone she trusted, a friend, a sibling, a pastor. She did. I gave her Sandra's number. I gave her the number for the county's legal aid office. I gave her the number for the National Domestic Violence Hotline because financial control is its own form of control, and I'd learned that the hard way. She came back to the workshop the following month. She'd looked at her accounts. She'd found things. She was scared and angry and still deciding what to do. But she knew. She wasn't in the dark anymore. That felt like something worth showing up for. My daughter got a financial advisor of her own, someone she found independently, someone who would be accountable to her alone. She called me after her first appointment, and there was something different in her voice. Not resolved, not past the grief or the anger, but oriented, pointed in a direction. "I made a list," she said. "All my accounts. Everything. I went through every single one. I know exactly what I have." "Good," I said. It felt strange, like I was doing something I should have been doing for years. "You were." I kept thinking, what else don't I know? Not just about finances. About anything. About Dad. About myself. She paused. "Is that going to go away?" "Some of it," I said honestly. "Some of it just becomes part of how you move through the world. You learn to check." On what would have been our 35th wedding anniversary, I did something I'd been thinking about for months. I drove to Lakeview Savings, not to do anything dramatic, not to confront anyone. I just wanted to see it, the building where Gerald had kept his other life, the counter where he'd made his deposits, the place that had been his secret for over a decade. I wanted to look at it the way you look at something that hurt you, directly, without flinching, so it can stop having that particular power. It was a small building, unremarkable, brick with a flat roof and a parking lot that needed repaving. A few cars, A drive-through window with a woman I couldn't see clearly behind the glass. I sat in the parking lot for a while, then I drove to a different bank, one Gerald had never walked into. I opened a savings account in my name, just my name. Margaret Elaine Whitmore. I deposited my first full-time library paycheck. The teller asked if I'd like checks ordered. Yes, I said. Just one name on them. Driving home, I thought about 31 years of Saturday mornings. All those hours I'd been in the garden, or reading, or on the phone with my sister while Gerald drove 40 minutes in the other direction and did whatever he did and came home with a small paper bag and kissed my forehead and said, "Everything's fine, everything's handled." I thought about how much I had trusted that. I thought about how trust and knowledge are not the same thing and how for too long I had confused them. I am 64 years old. I work full-time at the library. I run a financial literacy workshop once a month that has grown to 23 regular attendees. My daughter calls me twice a week. My son comes for dinner on Sundays with his family, and his kids climb on the furniture and leave crumbs everywhere. And I don't say a word because they are small and here and mine. My retirement is not what I planned, but it is real, and it is mine, and I know exactly what it is. Gerald was a good father. He was funny, and he was careful, and he drove 4 hours in a snowstorm to bring me soup when I had pneumonia in 1998. He also made choices that could have destroyed me. Both of those things are true. I've stopped trying to make them into one thing because they were never one thing. He was a person. People are complicated and flawed and capable of terrible things alongside the love. What I know now that I didn't know at 63 is this. Love is not the same as safety. Trust is not the same as knowledge. And a quiet life is not the same as a secure one. If anything I've told you sounds familiar, if there are accounts you've never seen, decisions made without you, answers that don't quite add up, please don't wait. Don't wait until there's a letter in a fireproof safe with your name on it. Don't wait until someone else hands you the truth. Look now. Ask now. It might be nothing, but if it isn't, you deserve to know while there's still time to act. I spent 31 Saturdays every year not asking where my husband was going. I won't spend another Saturday like that for as long as I live. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since Gerald died, not in any formal way. I'm not a philosopher. But when you spend 7 months untangling a lie that took 31 years to build, you start to see how everything connects backward. Every choice has a cost. Every silence has a consequence. Gerald made his first bad investment and then made a worse choice. He decided to hide it. That one decision, not the investment, but the hiding, is what destroyed us. Because the investment could have been survived. We could have sold the house, downsized, adjusted. We'd done hard things before, but hiding it meant taking out loans I didn't know about. It meant opening accounts in my name I never signed for. It meant building a second life, 40 minutes away, funded by work he never told me existed. One lie required another and another until the whole structure of our marriage was weight-bearing on things I was never allowed to see. I don't say that to make him a villain. I say it because I think it's the truest thing I've learned. Deception doesn't stay small. It grows to protect itself. What I keep returning to, though, is my own part in it, not my fault. I want to be clear about that distinction because Sandra made it early and I've held on to it. I did not cause what Gerald did, but I did make it easier for him by never asking. I handed over the finances the way you hand someone your coat, casually, without thinking about whether you'd need it later. I told myself it was trust. And it was. But I also told myself that not knowing was a kind of peace. That was the part that cost me. There is a version of intelligence that has nothing to do with education. It's the intelligence that asks, what do I actually know? Versus what am I assuming? I had a college degree and a good career and 34 years of life experience, and I did not apply that question to my own marriage. I assumed the retirement accounts were solid because Gerald showed me charts twice a year and they looked solid. I never read the statements. I never called the financial advisor myself. I never thought to. I'm not ashamed of that anymore. Shame isn't useful, but I am honest about it because the women who come to my workshop every month are doing the same thing I did, trusting instead of knowing, believing that asking questions means you don't trust your partner when actually it means you trust yourself. Those are not the same thing. What Gerald's choices produced, all that legal fighting, the judgment, the amended tax returns, the months of my son's evenings and my daughter's credit report and my own sleep. None of that was inevitable. It came from one man's decision to stop telling the truth and from one woman's decision to stop asking questions. Both of those things fed the outcome. What I know now is that integrity isn't something you perform. It's something you practice every day in small decisions, in whether you tell the truth when it's uncomfortable, in whether you look clearly at your own situation even when looking is hard. Gerald had many good qualities. He also failed that practice, repeatedly, for years. And I had my own failure. I confused comfort with safety and called it love. The hardware store bags are still in the garage. A few dozen of them, small and crinkled, full of things we never used. I haven't thrown them away yet. Maybe I will. But right now they remind me of something I think is worth remembering. The things we don't question have a way of becoming the things that surprise us most. I am 64 years old. I know exactly what is in every account with my name on it. I earned that knowledge the hard way. You don't have to.